Welcome back, everyone. Dan Vega here, Spring Developer Advocate at Broadcom. Today, we're going to be talking about multiple data sources using the JDBC Client in Spring Boot 3.2. Now, recently, I made a video on JDBC Client versus Spring Data JDBC, and I got a lot of really great feedback. So first off, thanks for that. But today, we're going to answer one of those questions, and this question comes from YouTube, comes from Ibrahim. It says, first of all, thank you very much for sharing this video. It was very helpful. I wonder what would be the solution for JDBC Client if we had multiple databases and multiple schemas. And this is an interesting question, right? Because we know that to get a data source up and running in Spring Boot is pretty trivial because of auto configuration. We see some things, we configure some things, and you have a database up and running. As soon as you need to configure something, though, we kind of back off and let you configure it as needed. And that's what happens when you need to configure multiple data sources in Spring. So we're going to take a look at an example of this today. We're going to start a new project over at start.spring.io. We'll set up a project that talks to two different data sources, and we'll see how we can configure those data sources and then use a JDBC client for each of those. So I hope you learned something new today. With that, let's get to it. All right, so we're going to start here at start.spring.io. We're going to create a new Maven project. You need Spring Boot 3.2 because we're going to be using the JDBC client, but I guess this would be the same if you were before 3.2 and you wanted to use multiple data sources for something like the REST template. So I'm going to fill in some metadata here. I'm going to say dev.danvega. We'll say the artifact is multiple DS demo. And we're going to choose Java 21. You could probably use Java 17 for this example. I'm going to go ahead and pick Spring Web. I'm also going to pick JDBC's API, so JDBC API, that will bring in the JDBC support that has like the JDBC template and what you need to connect to a data source. And then I'm just going to use an H2 database here. I contemplated using both the Postgres database and an H2. I think I'll simplify it for this one just so we can take a look at talking to multiple data sources. So we'll use two different in-memory H2 databases, and that's really all we need to get this project up and running. I'm going to go ahead and click generate. This will download a zip. You can open it up in whatever IDE you're most productive in. I'm going to open it up in IntelliJ IDEA. And with that, let's go ahead and write some code. All right, so here we are in our application. This is going to be a simple blogging application. We're going to use that same example to kind of walk through this. We're going to talk to a single data source first. Let's set up that one. This is going to be used for like saving posts. The second data source will be for maybe saving subscribers to our blog. And so that will use a separate database. But before we get into any of that, let's just get that first one out of the way. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new package here. I'm going to call this post. Inside of there, I am going to create a new post record. So I'm going to come in here and say post record. And this is going to have, let's just paste this in here, an ID, title, slug, date, time to read, and tags. All right, so we're going to go into application.properties here and set up that first data source. So I'm going to go in here and say spring.datasource.url is going to be equal to H2 memory. We'll call this blog. So I have my first data source, and then I need a username of SA and a password of nothing. Now, normally you don't need to do this. You can actually just change the generate. So I might come in here and say spring.generate unique name equals to false, and then you can set the name. I'm doing this because we're going to see some distinction between the first one and the second one when we get to adding that second database. So I have that in place. I'm going to need a schema. So I'm going to come in here and create a new resource. Now, normally I would just name this schema.sql, but because we have two different schemas here, I'm going to be a little bit more explicit. I'm going to go ahead and call this the blog schema.sql. And I'm going to go ahead and insert some code here. This is just creating a new table called post with those columns in it. I'm also going to insert a single post in there. This is my hello world post. And if we go ahead and save that, we should be good. Finally, I'm going to need a way to read and persist data to the database. I'm going to go ahead and create a post service. This is a class. This is going to be marked with the @service annotation. We are going to get an instance of the JDBC client. We'll call this JDBC Client. We'll get it through constructor injection. And then we just need a couple of methods to be able to access and persist data to and from the database. So I've done videos on this in the past. Even in the last one we took a look at it. I'm not going to get into kind of how the JDBC client is working. We're going to talk more about how to configure multiple ones of these. So I have some basic CRUD methods in here: find all, find by ID, create, update, and delete. So with that, I think we have everything we need to at least test out this initial connection to the first database. So if I go into application, I can go ahead and create a new command line runner. So I'm going to say bean command line runner, and then we are going to return args. It's Copilot doing its thing. That's not what I want. And then there. So I need to get an instance of that post repository. Post repository. Did I not? Oh, I'm sorry. Post service. Dan, come on, you got this. Post service. And now we can go ahead and use that. So all I want to do is get out all of the posts. So post service.find all. Go ahead and print them out, and we should be able to go ahead and run this application. If everything works, we should see them, and we did not. So let's figure out what's going on. URL must start with JDBC. Did I not start with JDBC? I did not. So JDBC :H2 in memory blog. Let's try that again. All right, we got another error here. Table post not found. Let's find out what's going on with our schema. Drop table if exists post. Create our table posts. Insert into post. Create table post. That looks fine. Insert into post. That looks okay. Okay, so we are going to have to name this schema for now. I forgot in my infinite wisdom here that we need to pick this up by convention. We will rename it later so that we can be distinct and have two separate schemas. That's what I have it named in the final code that, of course, you can find in the description below. But that post table was not there because we weren't reading a schema to go ahead and set that up. So let's see if we can go ahead and do that. And now we get our single post that we are outputting there to the command line. All right, so we know that that works, but I want to kind of point out one other thing here. So I'm going to create another bean. I'm going to create another command line runner. We'll call this the DS command line runner. Stands for DataSource. So we're going to return args. I don't want to print anything out. So let's just say that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get access to the data source. So we talked about this in the previous video. If you want to kind of go back and look at that, you can. Kind of the history of being able to connect to a database in Java, in Spring, what that means, what do you need to make that happen? And one of those things that you need is a data source. Now, you would normally have to create this on your own in an application like Java, but in Spring Boot, because we use auto configuration, we see that you have H2 on the class path. There's the JDBC API there. And because of that, we will go ahead and create a data source for you. This reads the properties from application.properties. It knows how to connect to a database now. We create that data source bean for you. This is great, but if you have to go ahead and do some configurations, you might have to create your own data source, or in this case, create two different data source beans to talk to two different data sources. But I just want to show you the original data source here. This is the data source that was created by Spring. And as you can see, Copilot is on its game today. I want to just print out the connection info. So get connection, get metadata, get URL will tell us exactly where this database is connecting to. And if we look at this, we can see, of course, we know this, but JDBC H2 in memory blog. This is going to be important because what I want to do is basically override the connection to the database so we can create our own data source bean, so we can then create a second data source bean. This is going to be important. I'll come back to this method so we can actually get access to both data sources and see that the connection URLs are indeed pointing to the right database. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and reconfigure this to use our own data source, and then we can go ahead and add a second data source. All right, so let's close some of this down. I'm going to introduce a new package here. Let's go ahead and call this subscriber. We're going to create a new subscriber record in here. We'll call this subscriber. We'll say this is a record. I'll go ahead and paste some info in here. We'll go ahead and create a subscriber service. So subscriber service. This will be a class. We'll mark this with that service. And then we'll come back to this in a second. So we're going to need to basically update this. I want to rename this to kind of what I was talking about before. We're going to have a blog specific schema. So blog.schema.sql. And then I'm going to introduce a new schema here. So subscriber schema.sql. And now we have two different schemas for our application. I'm going to go ahead and paste this in, and there we go. So we have ID, name, email, and the primary key being ID. So we'll insert into subscriber. We're just going to insert one single record. That will give us enough to kind of give some distinction between the two. So now in the application.properties, we currently have the spring.datasource. Now, spring.datasource is how we configure a single data source in our application. But we're going to need to take a different approach here if we want to go ahead and set up multiple data sources. So I'm going to go ahead and paste in my properties and we'll walk through them. First off, I'm going to enable the H2 console. We want to be able to take a look at the database and see everything. And then I'm going to set up two separate connections to two different databases. And I'm going to use my own properties here. I'm going to say app.datasource, and then I'm going to name each database. So this could work for 3 or 4 if you wanted to, but here we have 2 data sources. The first one is blog, same properties as before, username and password. Actually, we want to say, let's say we'll probably need 2 different connections. Actually, let's just leave it at, let's say, SA blog. I say subscriber, and then no password for each of them. So we have 2 separate connections here, but if we go ahead and run the application now, nothing's going to happen, right? We see H2 on the class path. In fact, we're not defining anything under spring.datasource. So a randomly generated ID for the data source will get created and no schema will get picked up. And things just won't work yet. So how do we go ahead and make this happen? All right, so what we need to do in our main package here is create a new configuration class. I'm going to call this, let's call this data source configuration. This is, of course, going to be a configuration class. I'm going to proxy bean methods equals false, and we are off and running. So what we need to do is define our different connections to our different database. So I'm going to start here with our blog, and we need to go ahead and set this up. So I'm going to create a new bean. Now, if we're going to create 2 different data sources, we need to mark one as primary. This is the primary data source. And we need to say, where is it going to get its configuration properties from? Now, remember, we just defined that in app.datasource.blog. So we have that here. What we're going to do is we're going to say, yep, Copilot, you are on your money here. So data source properties is how we kind of fill out the data source properties. And we're going to return new data source properties. But again, those are getting pulled from app.datasource.blog, right? So we have our properties, but we need an actual connection to the database now. So we're going to create one more bean. We'll go ahead and say that this is the primary. And we are going to use a data source. We are going to say this is a Hikari data source. And this is going to be called blog data source. Let's see, Copilot. You are saying data source properties. That's the blog data source properties. This looks pretty good. Let me just double check it. Yep. So we're just giving it a type. We're building it and we're returning it. So this will create our data source. Now there's one more step needed because we are using kind of a special schema, right? We renamed it. We basically want to create this data source and point it to that schema so it can get initialized. If we weren't using a separate schema and we were using like something like Spring Data JPA where that schema was created for us, we could probably skip this step, but we need to do this here. So I'm going to say at bean, this is a data source script. Is that database initializer? Yes. I think you are on your game today, Copilot. And again, this is kind of pulling from a previous project as I set this tutorial up. So that's what's happening here. So we're going to create some new settings. We're going to say, hey, go ahead and look for that schema location in the class path because it's under source main resources. Look for something called blog schema.sql. Go ahead and set the mode to embedded because that is what we are using. And then this is, we don't want to do this here. We actually just want to call this data source and let's get this through here and data source. Now, the problem with this is going to be that at the end of the day, we might have two data sources, right? We only have one right now, but we're going to end up having two. So I need to be very specific with what data source this is. And all I'm going to do is say blog data source. So now it knows exactly which one. So that gets wired in here automatically for us. And then we could pass it to our data source script initializer, which just takes the data source and what settings. Really, the settings here is just, hey, this is embedded. This is the schema where I want you to look. So with that being said, we want configuration. That's why that didn't work. So with that said, I think we can go ahead. Let's see here. Let's go ahead and try and run our application and see if it still works as it did before. And it does. So we still have our blog post and we are still using our connection to our in-memory blog database. So great, that is data source 1. Now we can start to define data source 2, which is our subscribers. So this is going to look pretty similar. I'm just going to say public data source properties. We'll say data source properties. Actually, let's say subscriber data source properties. This is going to be a new data source properties. And just like before, we need to go ahead and say that this is a bean. And where are we going to pull? Remember, we did this before with at configuration properties. We are pulling this from app.datasource.subscribers. That is where that's coming from. All right, next we need to create another bean. This is going to be the actual data source. So this will return. I'm just going to show you a different way of doing this. Let's see, subscriber data source. This looks pretty good. Subscriber data source. So the qualifier, again, because we have multiple data source properties, now we need to be specific. We are going to say, hey, the subscriber data source properties is what you want to use here. And then we're going to use a new data source builder. This is just a different example of a way to do this. Looks like I misspelled that. So we're going to pass in the URL. And we're going to get the URL from those subscriber properties, the username and the password. Again, just a different way of building a data source. And this one, it's a Hikari data source. This is just a plain data source. So just two different ways to do that here. So finally, we need to do the same thing as we did before. We want a data source script database initializer because we want to go ahead and use a different schema for this database. So here we're going to go ahead and make sure we have that qualifier again. This is the subscriber data source. And we're going to set our schema location to the class path of subscribers.schema. Let me just make sure I made that plural. I did not. So let's go ahead and refactor this so it's the same as what I have in the GitHub repository. So let's go ahead and refactor that. We're saying subscribers-schema.sql blog schema.sql. Yes. Okay. So far so good. This is exactly what the data source configuration is going to look like. But now we need to do a couple of things, right? So first off, back in our post service, we have this JDBC client. We need to be very specific with what JDBC client this is. So here I'm going to add a qualifier and I'm going to say this is the blog JDBC client, which I don't think we've created yet. So let's do that. So let's go back over to our application and let's just create each of these. I'm going to create a new bean. Again, this can go in any configuration class. I'm kind of doing this for simplicity's sake in the form of a demo, but yeah, you can do this anywhere. So this is going to be a JDBC client because, again, this is similar to the data source. When you only have a single data source, we create an instance of the JDBC client that uses that default data source. If you have multiple data sources, you need to be very specific. We need to create our own JDBC client and tell it which database it's going to use. So we're going to create a couple of JDBC clients here. One is going to be the JDBC client here. We're going to pass in a qualifier. Again, we want to be very specific. We're saying blog data source. And the way that you create a new JDBC client is by using this static factory method here called create, and then you pass in a data source. So we want to create a second bean. This will be of JDBC client. We'll call this the subscriber JDBC client, right? I just want to make sure it's singular. Yes. We're going to add a qualifier here called subscriber data source. Now we have two data sources here. And then we're going to call the create method and pass in that data source. So it looks like we're getting there. We're almost there. Back in our subscriber service, we don't have anything here yet. We'll do something similar. We'll get a JDBC client. We'll have the qualifier for the correct one. In my find all method, all I'm doing is selecting ID, name, and email from subscriber, and I'm turning that into a list. We know that in the schema, there's only one, so we only have a single row there. But that's okay. Let's take a look. I'm getting some little squigglies here telling me something's not right. And that's because this is at bean, Dan. Okay, that's a little bit better. So now back in my application, I'm going to do a couple things. One, I want to get both data sources here. I want to say at qualifier is the blog data source, right? So let's call this blog data source. Now I can change this to blog data source, and I'm going to get the other one as well, which is the subscriber data source, so that down here I can basically say, what is the subscriber data source, get that connection, and get the metadata URL. So let's rerun this and see if those two URLs point to the right database, and they do. So what this is telling me right now is we've successfully created the appropriate beans to connect to multiple data sources. So to round this kind of demo out, we have this post service. I'm going to get my subscriber service. Call this subscriber service. Why did it erase that? And what I want to do is get all the subscribers. So I'll call subscriber service.findAll, and we'll go ahead and print those out. And let's see what that looks like. And there we go. So we've printed out our posts. We printed out our subscribers. We have connections to two different databases. And if you wanted to kind of examine this further, the H2 console is enabled, so you can go over to the browser and take a look at each database separately if you wanted to. All right, and there you have it. How to connect to multiple data sources in Spring and then use the JDBC client for multiple data sources. I thought that was a really interesting question. I love getting questions like that. So hey, if you're watching a YouTube video like this one and you have questions, please leave them in the comments below. You can also find me at danvega@gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter. SpringOfficeHours.io is our podcast, so go ahead and check that out. There are a bunch of different ways you can give me questions, and I'm trying to find a good way to kind of wrangle those questions into a single place where I can get to them quicker. So please bear with me if you do. With that, if you learned something new today, friends, do me a big favor. Give me a thumbs up on this video, subscribe to the channel, and as always, happy coding.